Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Estefany Sosa, and today I will present a class project that evolved from one of my linguistics courses about my acquisition of Japanese through an online modality. And first, I'll give you some background through the theoretical framework of this study. Then I'll talk about my actual experience along with theoretical discussions, insights, and next steps. So the background, why is it important to analyze and reflect how we learned a second language? First of all, it's a very complicated process. There's a lot of things going on in the brain simultaneously. Our learning environment has a lot to do with this, the type of input, the opportunities for interaction, as well as the implicit rules that govern language use. So what's a self-reflective case study or a diary study? This involves collecting one's own oral and written samples in the L2 or second language along with learning logs. And this study was based on Schmidt 1986, where he documents his development of conversational Brazilian Portuguese during the course of 5 months. And one of his main arguments is that we cannot know what goes on in our learners' minds. So why should we assume we would know how we would learn a language ourselves? So as part of my class project, we had to put ourselves through this process to reflect on our language acquisition in order to have more compassion for our learners. So what's it like to learn Japanese online during the COVID-19 pandemic? First of all, the setting, it took place over 2 semesters here at SJSU and 2 synchronous Japanese courses. The interactions were through Zoom during scheduled meetings, and there were also text-based asynchronous communications with the instructor and the TA. The participant, it's me. It's a self-reflective study. I'm a 27-year-old female. I'm bilingual. I've studied other languages in a structured classroom environment, as well as a few other languages in a more informal manner. I have linguistics training, and I also teach Spanish. Materials and procedures, as I mentioned earlier, this involves collecting logs or diaries of my own acquisition of Japanese, as well as oral and written samples like videos and writing assignments. Theoretical discussion. Okay, so cross-linguistic influences. So Lourdes Ortega, one of the main contributors to second language studies, has mentioned that if you've studied another L2, it's going to be much easier to acquire a third or a fourth, and I can definitely second to that. I saw a lot of positive transference in my acquisition of Japanese. So first of all, in the area of pronunciation, Spanish and Arabic have helped a lot. In the area of vocabulary, there's a lot of loan words from English and Spanish and Japanese. In terms of the syntax or the sentence structure of Japanese, I had some familiarity with that based on my previous studies of Turkish and Hindi. Nonetheless, there continue to be many areas of difficulties for me with Japanese. In terms of the syntactic notion of subject versus topic markers, flexible word orders and particles, and tense marking on adjectives. And this is especially difficult because Japanese adjectives need to inflect depending on if the action being described took place in the past or if it's non-past. And also the use of pronouns in Japanese is extremely restricted. So the importance of interaction and corrective feedback. Does online learning equal fewer opportunities for interaction? That could be the case. We're all so used to studying face-to-face. However, it's quite possible to acquire a language solely online through synchronous interactions by getting oral corrective feedback during Zoom sessions from the instructor, as well as collaborating with peers in Zoom breakout rooms to carry out meaning-making tasks, which pushes the learner to produce output. So the more the learner speaks, the more they learn. I also had many opportunities for asynchronous interactions through detailed feedback on homework, as well as writing assignments. And I'm going to skip this slide for the interest of time, but if there are no questions, I can come back to it. In terms of motivation, like I said, this project started out in one of my linguistics courses. So I began learning Japanese for fun. I didn't think much of it, but my motivation skyrocketed once I started getting really good test scores and excellent feedback on homework. I had an excellent instructor. There was ease of learning, opportunities to ask questions. So instructors do play a very important role in learning a language, especially in online settings. Okay, and there's 4 different types of profiles when it comes to motivation, and at the beginning of my acquisition of Japanese, I can say I was motivated to learn pretty much any language, but it wouldn't have sustained my interest long enough. However, when I identified the instrumentality in learning Japanese, that is when my motivation skyrocketed. And I realized that I could utilize Japanese when I move on to my doctoral studies, and I can continue to study Spanish speakers who learn Japanese and vice versa. So what did I learn about myself during this whole process? Because that was the purpose of this project, to put ourselves in the learner's shoes. Well, I learned that I have a pretty good memory, and this is what's essential in learning a language. People who have a higher working memory capacity are more likely to notice corrections during live interactions as well as asynchronous interactions. And secondly, I realized that my personality type, I'm an introvert, plays a huge role in the way I learn a language. So one of the most important aspects of introverted learners is that they sacrifice speaking less fluently for having more accuracy in their grammatical production. So that's something we should have in mind with our learners. Maybe our learners do know what they want to say, but they're just shy and they need more time. Language socialization is another thing that is extremely important when acquiring a language. And what is this? It's the use of language, the non-written rules of how we use our language, the cultural practices of the speech community, as well as their values. And if you're familiar with Japanese, this is something that is very evident in the way the language is structured, specifically through the interactional particle ne. I won't go into details here, but if someone has questions later, I can explain it. And Japanese has basically 2 ways of speaking. There's a formal way and an informal way, and you need to know when to use which. Otherwise, you can offend people and you can get in a lot of trouble. And Japanese, like Spanish, is also a very high context culture. So a lot of things are implicit, they're not said. You need to gather it from the environment. And what are my next steps? So I will continue this diary project because I plan to continue to study Japanese. I ended up really enjoying the language, thanks to my instructors here at SJSU. And I plan to turn this quantitative analysis into this qualitative analysis into a quantitative analysis to track my development. And it's definitely a contribution to my field because it's an uncommon language pair, studying learners of Japanese who their L1 is Spanish and vice versa. So thank you for your time. If there's no questions, I could possibly speak about cognition, but if you do have questions, I'm happy to answer them at this time.
Hello, Stephanie. We do have 2 questions, but I think you could go to the other slide and just explain a little bit more because it sounded interesting really quick.
Sure, thank you. Okay, let's see. So cognition, one of the things I find super fascinating in acquiring a language is how the brain processes new information. And one of the things that I noticed in my first semester of learning Japanese is that it was effortless. It almost seemed like I was learning through osmosis. A lot of the learning took place implicitly. The instructor didn't do a lot of thorough grammatical explanations. However, there were some things that had low saliency that weren't as evident to the learners, so the instructor did have to point these out. And one example of this was the interjectory particle ne, which I stated here, and this has a very important social component. So the instructor had to explain its usage and how it works syntactically in the language as well. So that was what I didn't get to say before. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so we do have 2 questions. I have one question. What are some sounds that are similar to, in Spanish to Japanese that would be like easy acquisition for a Spanish speaker?
All of them.
Oh, great.
Yes,
And
all of them.
great. How was the experience of learning a language during the pandemic?
I have to tell you, it was a bit frustrating at times because sometimes I just wish I could turn to a classmate or a more advanced speaker and ask them a question. But, I was limited to that class time through Zoom. But, it's the same in face to face. You have that limited amount of time when you go into the classroom. So even though it took place entirely online, I do believe now that it's completely possible to learn a language, and you just have to seek out those opportunities for interaction.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Does the audience have any more questions? No, thank you so much, Stephanie. We really appreciate you for your time, for the effort you put in, and the short timing, but it was interesting and very relevant to these times. And we will be setting up for the next session, for the next speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you.